Hello, I am Eric Banks, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2021 Brooklyn Book Festival for a conversation with three amazing world authors, Kaye Sheng, Leonardo Padura, and Sjón. Before we begin, I want to let you know that books by authors in this program can be purchased in the link below. Now I'd like to introduce our authors who are joining us this evening from many parts of the world. First, Sjón. Born in Reykjavik in 1962, Sjón is the author of 5 previous novels for which he has won several awards. In addition, he has written more than 5 poetry collections, several opera librettos, and lyrics for various artists, including Björk. He was nominated for an Oscar for his lyrics in Dancer in the Dark and co-wrote the script of the film The Northman with director Robert Eggers. In 2017, he became the 3rd writer, following Margaret Atwood and David Mitchell, to contribute to Future Library, a public artwork based in Norway spanning 100 years. Red Milk is his most recent novel. Sheng Keyi is the author of 10 novels, as well as numerous short stories and novellas. Her debut novel in English translation, Northern Girls, was longlisted for the Man Asian Literary Prize in 2012. She has received numerous literary awards, including the Chinese People's Literature Prize, the Yu Dafu Prize for Fiction, and the Chinese Literature Media Award. Death Fugue is her most recent book in English and remains banned from publication in China. Leonardo Padura was born in Havana in 1955. He is the author of The Man Who Loved Dogs and Heretics, and his genre-bending literary crime novels featuring Detective Mario Conde have been widely translated and formed the basis for Netflix's 2016 miniseries, 4 Seasons in Havana. I also want to note that we're joined by 2 additional people today, Eric Abramson and Anna Kushner, who will be helping us with translation as need be. Anna with Leonardo, and Eric will be helping us with Kaye as necessary. So I want to thank you all for joining us, and it's a real pleasure to see you this afternoon across the monitor. Yes, sorry. Okay, the title of this panel is, as you know, Twilight Zones of History, and it's an interesting question, how this particular phrase captures precisely what links the books that we will be primarily focusing on tonight, which, as I've already mentioned, are Death Fugue, Red Milk, and Transparency of Time in English translation. But it gives us a focus on how each writer has approached a particular set of historical, a particular type of historical material and particular historical material in these novels. When I think of Twilight and this Twilight Zones of History, I'm reminded of the French phrase that we all learned in our first year of French, entre chien et loup, between the dog and the wolf, this crepuscular zone where day and night and light and darkness are intertwined, and it's not clear which is which, whether we're facing the light or we're facing the dark. Each of these novels is particular and unique, but in each, history operates in a kind of twilight zone and exists in a kind of twilight zone. And to a degree, despite the great differences between each of these books, history has a texture that is quite critical to the larger project of each novel. I'd like to start our panel's discussion this evening by, and I think you've all been encouraged also to send in in the audience your questions and comments to us, and I'll be keeping an eye on those as we have our panel tonight. And as time permits, I'm certainly happy to ask your questions for you. But I'd like to begin by asking our panelists, what prompted you or attracted you to have these narratives serve as the motor of your novels? In the case of, in each novel, I'll just say very quickly, in the Transparency of Time, operating throughout the novel is the backstory of a mysterious and stolen Black Madonna sculpture. In Death Fugue, the legacy of Tienanmen Square and its erasure from official memory looms large. And in Red Milk, there's the haunting story of an Icelandic fascist and his party. So I'd like to begin by asking again what prompted our panelists to address these narratives and to have these narratives serve at the center of their novels. And I'll start by asking Leonardo this question.
Muchas gracias, Eric, y muchas gracias al festival por esta posibilidad. Muchas gracias a Ana por ayudarme en la traducción.
I'd like to thank you, Eric, and the festival for having me, and thank you to Anna for helping out with translation.
Cuando uno va a escribir una novela, tiene algún propósito, que es un propósito que está por encima del desarrollo dramático mismo de los acontecimientos.
When you're going to write a novel, you have a purpose that is actually above the purpose of the dramatic elements that will be in that narrative.
Y en este caso, yo quería escribir sobre determinados comportamientos de la condición humana que son permanentes, que pueden ser repetitivos a lo largo de la historia.
In this case, I wanted to write about certain behaviors of the human condition that are constant, that just repeat themselves through history.
Y como siempre, partía de un presente cubano, en mi novela El hombre que amaba a los perros, en Herejes, en todas, yo siempre parto de un presente cubano.
As always, I start with a Cuban present, as I did in The Man Who Loved Dogs and Heretics. It's the story begins in modern day Cuba.
Pero trato de buscar entonces en la historia unos puntos de apoyo que me sirvan para ver cómo se refleja eso en ese presente cubano.
But I try to find points within history to kind of study myself to reflect that reality that is lived in Cuba today.
En el caso de esta novela, el propósito era ver cómo la historia puede cambiar la vida de los hombres. Un acontecimiento histórico puede cambiar la vida de un hombre.
So in this novel specifically, the purpose was to see how events in history can change the life of an individual.
Porque en el caso nuestro en Cuba, un proceso, un acontecimiento histórico, como fue la Revolución Cubana, cambió por completo el curso de la historia del país.
So in our case in Cuba, an event such as the revolution changed the entire course of our lives on the island.
Las revoluciones tienen esa característica, cambian los rumbos de la historia, por eso se llama revolución, porque es una vuelta de tuerca que se le da a la historia.
Revolutions do that. They change the course of history, and that's why they're called revolutions. They change the machinery of history.
Y muchas veces nuestra voluntad individual queda al margen de las posibilidades de cambiar esos acontecimientos. Somos parte de la vorágine de esos acontecimientos.
And so often our own desires as individuals are left aside in that historical process.
Quería ver entonces cómo esto ocurría en el presente e iluminarlo con acontecimientos que habían ocurrido en distintos momentos de la historia.
So I wanted to study how this was happening in the present and shed a larger light on it by focusing on specific historical events.
Y como quiera que el elemento de la fe, de la creencia, de la religiosidad, es un elemento que ha acompañado al hombre durante muchos siglos.
And so this element of faith, of religiosity that has been part of human history for centuries,
pues decidí que todo estuviera centrado alrededor de esta Virgen Negra de origen africano, llegada a España y después traída a Cuba.
So I wanted to focus these issues on this Black Madonna who came from Africa and then was taken to Spain and then ended up in Cuba.
El robo de la Virgen en Cuba me permite desarrollar la trama policíaca de la historia.
So the theft of this Madonna in Cuba allows me to develop the noir element of the novel.
En un momento muy especial de la historia de Cuba, porque es justo antes de que se anuncie que Cuba y los Estados Unidos van a volver a restablecer relaciones diplomáticas.
And it takes place in a very specific moment of Cuban history, which is just prior to the reestablishment of diplomatic relations between the US and Cuba.
Y a partir de ese acontecimiento del robo de la Virgen, pues empieza una historia que se va desarrollando hacia atrás en el pasado.
So then, starting with the theft of that Madonna, things start moving backwards in history.
Con un personaje absolutamente literario, un personaje que se repite su nombre y determinadas características a través de un recorrido de 10 siglos casi.
So I use a character who is completely fictional, whose name is repeated over and over again in different characters through approximately 10 centuries of history.
Porque voy contando la historia de la Virgen y voy contando la historia de los hombres que han estado cerca de esa Virgen que se ha perdido en Cuba en el presente.
So as I start telling the story of this Black Madonna, I'm also telling the story of all of these men who were by her side throughout history until the present day when she's stolen in Cuba.
Y así voy de la Guerra Civil Española a la llamada Guerra Civil Catalana del siglo XV.
And thus I go from the Spanish Civil War of the last century back to the Catalan Civil Wars of the 15th century.
Y termino en la época de los cruzados, en el momento de la caída de San Juan de Acre, la última ciudad cristiana del Oriente.
And I go all the way back to the Crusades, to the moment in which the last Christian city falls.
Y a través de la Virgen voy mostrando estos comportamientos de este hombre y voy viendo las convulsiones de la historia que cambiaron la vida de este hombre.
So I go evaluating all of these historic events that change the lives of these individual men.
Nunca le digo a los lectores, pongo la historia para que entiendas el presente.
I never tell readers that I'm giving you history so that you can understand the present.
Es algo que los lectores tienen que descubrir con el mismo proceso de acercamiento a la novela.
It's something that readers need to discover for themselves as they go through the novel.
Y yo les rezo a la Virgen para que los lectores sean capaces de entenderlo.
And I pray to the Virgin that that readers are capable of understanding it.
I think your prayers were answered.
Cree que la Virgen te oyó.
Okay, that's much to chew on. Thank you so much. Kaye, I'll bring you in now. I realize this question has a very different kind of valence in posing it to you, but what attracted you to writing about this moment from a different period in Chinese history? I noted that your book is dedicated to those born in the 1960s in China, and you can also say that it was written several years ago. Its reception has been delayed in time. But if I could ask you to comment on, it seems an absurd question to say, why would you want to write about that moment in the history of China, in recent history of China? But what did attract you to make that the particular focus of the novel? In highly allegorical form, I should say.
大家好，主持人好，很高兴参加布鲁克林这个图书节，也很荣幸跟2位杰出的作家讨论我们今天的这个写作的主题。我也要特别感谢我的老朋友 Eric 来做我的翻译。
Hello, everyone. Thanks very much to the hosts and to our other guests. I'm very pleased to have a chance to be able to participate in the Brooklyn Book Fair today, speaking together with Sjón and Leonardo. I also would like to thank my old friend Eric for helping me with interpretation today.
当然，特别是感谢我的出版社 Restless Books， 他们为《Death Fugue》这本书做出了很大的努力。
I also need to thank my publisher, Restless Books, my US publisher, for all the work that they put into bringing this book to the market.
我写这部书的原因要追溯到我还没有当作家的时候，大约在1996年左右，我认识了一些知识分子，有好几位天安门广场的亲历者，他们给我讲了很多故事。
So the roots of my decision to write this book go back to actually before I was a writer. Back in 1996 or thereabouts, I met several other writers and intellectuals who told stories about their own personal experiences during the Tienanmen Square incident of 1989, and it was their personal stories that stuck with me.
他们用他们尚有余温的这种革命热情，向我描述当年的理想， 浪漫和悲壮的情景，是我这个在2000公里以外的小乡村通过电视机看不到的。
So of course they were all writers. They excelled at explaining themselves. They excelled at language, and so they told me in very idealistic, romantic, tragic terms of their participation in the protests at that time. And of course, to me, somebody who came from a small village, who unable to see any of these incidents on the television, it was deeply moving.
我感到非常震惊，因为历史的官方叙事和民间叙事是如此的不同，这是吸引我进一步去探究真相。
And so it was sort of shocking to me because they were telling me of a history that I had never heard about through official channels, and it was a great shock to me to realize that the official history and the people's history were so completely different. And that's what eventually led me to look more deeply into this history.
那时候我在中国最南端深圳，离香港只有1墙之隔。那时候可以很容易就能买到走私的禁书、盗版的禁书。这个时候我看了一些个人的日记、录像、纪录片。
At that time, I was living in Shenzhen in the south of China, which was really basically just across a bridge from Hong Kong. And Hong Kong was a place where you could buy all kinds of banned books, pirated books. And I watched a lot of documentaries, read a lot of memoirs, read a lot of books about this period of history.
那么12年以后，当我开始写《死亡赋格》的时候呢，仍然还有朋友从香港和台湾给我带书过来。
And so 12 years later, when I came to start writing the book that became Death Fugue, I still had friends visiting me from Hong Kong and bringing me more books, bringing me more materials.
事实上，材料看得越多，越感觉小说很难以达到这个现实的冲击力。所以我在写作的当中，首先就是避免去使用现实主义的写作手法。
And the more actual historical materials I read, the more difficult it seemed that it would be to sort of represent this period of history in fiction. The harder it seemed to be able to fictionalize it. And so I decided that when I was going to start with this narrative, I would avoid a strictly realist approach to writing the book.
而且我是要有意摆脱具体历史事件的这种束缚和这个框架。具体的这个历史事件对这部小说来说，它只是一根导火索，一团创作热情的火焰和我的一种历史情节。
And I would avoid using the actual historical events of that time as a framework for the novel even. So really that historical period and everything that I read about the things that happened at that time really just served as sort of a fuse, served to light a fuse for my own enthusiasm and my own desire to explore history.
为了建立一套书中的社会制度，我还去阅读了托马斯·莫尔的《乌托邦》，也部分的借鉴了他所描述的这个理想社会。
And so in order to sort of find my way towards the literary narrative that I would use in this book, I read Thomas More's Utopia and used that sort of as a reference point for creating this kind of the narrative framework for the book.
那么已经成为经典的这个反乌托邦3部曲，像《我们》、1984、美丽新世界，像那个书中所描写的那些破坏人伦、扼杀人性、管控思想的这种事情，还是在当今世界发生。这些都给这本书的创作带来了比较丰富的启示。
And of course, I drew a lot of inspiration from the classics of dystopian fiction, Brave New World, 1984, all these books about sort of the political project to destroy people's language and destroy people's memories. These all contributed a lot to my own writing.
不在历史现场，并不是局外人。这小说是以虚构的形式对历史的思索和记录，也是我个人一种独特的参与历史的方式。
So I wasn't there at the time, but the fact that I did not participate in these events doesn't mean that I'm on the outside. These historic events are a way for me to participate in this period of history and to participate in this element of my own society.
That's a really interesting point you make at the end, as a offering a way of participation and offering a way to enter into the moment of those events, which I find really a lot to think about, and a sort of great way of putting it. Sjón, I'll ask you now as well. How did you what pulled you into writing about such a difficult figure? You have a terrific afterword in Red Milk, but what drew you to to this particular topic of such an odious figure, and the writing about such an odious figure? So.
Yeah. I'll start by giving my thanks to everyone, and it's great to be here with you and to learn about the other books, and just to meet you and to be at the literary festival. Even though it is through screens, it is still a literary festival. I'll just start by saying to people who don't know anything about the book that it is a book about a young man in the 50s and 60s who found a neo-Nazi party in Iceland, a neo-Nazi party that in that time didn't get anywhere, but still it happened. And I think that in most of my novels, I have worked with Icelandic history, how Icelandic history and life on this small island up in the North Atlantic connects with the grander narratives of global history. And within that small Icelandic history, I have been occupied with how individuals connect with all of it. And one of the things that fascinates me is that somehow we are all walking through our personal narratives within this gigantic system that is history, this machine of history. And somehow we engage with it on a deeply personal level through ideas, through what ideas attract us, how we get involved in ideologies or theories about how this world functions. And this means that most of the characters that I have worked with are outsiders. They are operating somehow on the outskirts of society because they have become occupied with ideas. And in this case, we have a young man in the 1960s. He's born 1938 in the Second World War. His father is Norwegian. Norway is under occupation. His father is devastated by the horrible news coming from the Nazi occupation of his home country. And the world is at war. And this small boy somehow still gets pushed in the direction that makes him ready to fall for the ideas of Nazism, even after the Second World War has ended, even after the revelations of the Holocaust, even after the trials of Eichmann in Israel. He is at the mercy of these ideas. And I just wanted to go into this small life. I wanted to see what would happen if I tried to understand how this man came about. And it is based on a real life character who did exactly the things that you can read about in the book. He becomes occupied with Nazi ideas. He starts reaching out to people all over the world. He starts this small cell in Iceland with the dream of becoming a big, powerful force in this small country. And he's doing this with the most unwelcome ideology, I think, of all times, you know, except for the countries where it gained ground and the Third Reich in the 30s and 40s. So I just wanted to explore that tiny story, that fragment of Icelandic history. I had read about this Nazi party. It was always brushed over. It was never gone into. People never went into what really happened. It was always brushed off as something completely insignificant. And then obviously in the last 10 years, neo-Nazi parties have been gaining ground all over the world. And yeah, I had had this idea for years, but all of a sudden it was urgent to engage with it. And like I say, this is a tiny life. This is a small novel. And the challenge was to engage with this character and to try to understand him, to bring myself to this character, the things that I had done as a young idealistic surrealist in Reykjavik. It was just a challenge. Was there a common ground? Usually we see neo-Nazis either as monsters or clowns or monstrous clowns. But we know, I mean, from the pictures from Charlottesville in the United States, the young men who were marching there with torches in their white polo shirts were not just some ignorants crawling out of dark corners. These were young men with jobs and proper lives, and still they were there marching for the worst cause in history.
You know, one of the things that these novels all have in common in some way or another is that even in the case of Mario Conde, everyone, the protagonists are all failed writers in some sense or another, or they're writers. I mean, in your case, Sjón, you really, the novel is sort of powered by his own words. It's very much of a epistolary novel. It's a novel in letters. Was it important to you in some way was it, I'd like for you to just say something about, you know, your approach in having his own words be the substance of the novel. It's a way I think that you're able to not overly psychologize what your character represents. But I wonder if you could say something about that decision.
Yeah, because I was trying to make him real. That's what we're always doing when we're writing novels. We're trying to make these people real somehow, and to expose his mind, his longings. I discovered that the letter was the perfect tool. The letters are written over I think 10 years, and through the novels we can track his development from like a 15-year-old who is like hearing about these ideas for the first time, or like getting involved with them, till the very end when he's founded the Nazi party. And it helped me give different angles. I could watch him from different angles, because when we write letters, we are putting on a performance. We are reaching out to someone. We are writing to our mother. We are writing to our best friend, our girlfriend, or we might be writing to the leader of the neo-Nazi party in Sweden. And what face do we put on when we do that? And so I really wanted to show many different sides to him. At the same time, it was important for me to give him the power of words. He was the original character was a letter writer. And that's what gave me the idea. But in an attempt to make him a complex character, a character that we couldn't just brush off as someone stupid who was like trapped by these ideals, to show that he had a way with words, which means that he has a way with thinking, was important.
That's interesting. And Kaye, I think you also have at the kind of center of your Death Fugue this surgeon, poet turned surgeon who's abandoned writing after the allegorized Tienanmen Square. Do you want to say something about putting at the centerpiece another writer who's also made a certain kind of, who is a writer, and in your case has turned into something else and finds that writing has no longer has the same meaning?
对的，死亡赋格我的主角设置是一个诗人，那么诗人我认为他就是象征着这个时代是一个朝气蓬勃的时代，一个充满理想和希望和那个追求精神的这样的一个时代。
Yeah, so the protagonist of my story is originally a poet, a former poet. And I chose a poet for this character because I believe the poetry and poets can represent the sort of the idealism of this age. The poetry in itself is sort of a stand-in for all of the ideals and the romance of that particular era.
但是在1989之后呢，他放弃了写诗，而当了一名医生，这就是意味着他放弃了激情，放弃了理想，放弃了信仰，放弃了抗争，放弃了对自由思想的追求。
After 1949, he gives up poetry, becomes a surgeon. And this is sort of an indication of the way that he has abandoned his ideals, abandoned his passion, abandoned his original faith, and abandoned his youth in essence.
这也是我要在这本书里主要表述的，就是说关于人最核心的问题，也就是说，这是大部分知识分子的精神写照，他们放弃了理想和信仰。
And so that represents one of the main points that I wanted to touch on in this novel, is the way that Chinese intellectuals and writers after the Tiananmen Square incident gave up on their ideals, gave up on their professions, and went and did other things.
他们认为是诗歌没有用，诗歌没有枪口的冷漠，诗歌也没有子弹的速度。因此呢，从这个意义上来讲嘛，就是一个历史事件，同时也成为了一场精神上的大屠杀。
And to hear them talk about it, they say that poetry was no longer useful. Poetry wasn't good for anything. It wasn't as cold as guns. It wasn't as fast as bullets. And so in a sense, while we had an actual massacre, there was also, in a sense, 1989 was a massacre of the spirit.
我认为诗歌最能代表一个人的纯粹，也最能代表一个时代的品质。墨西哥诗人那个 Octavio Paz 他说过 ，I don't think we can have a good society if we don't have a good poetry。我非常赞同。
I think the poetry can represent the purest elements of an individual, also the purest elements of a society and its ideals. I really like a quote from Octavio Paz, which is goes, "We can't have a good society unless we have good poetry."
诗歌以及诗人的消失，也就象征着这个社会的道德的堕落。社会没有诗歌，就像人没有灵魂是一样的。
The disappearance of poets and poetry indicates the moral degradation of a society. It's the same as a person losing their soul.
这也正是中国在1989年之后的一个状况，一个 唯利是图的拜金社会的迅速的崛起，金钱和享乐掩盖了历史的事实，也麻醉了个人内心的创伤。
And this is what happened in Chinese society post 1989. There was this incredibly speedy rise of a commercial society, consumer society, the pursuit of money, overcoming ideals and poetry, numbing the individual mind, numbing individual passions.
历史对我来说，它是映照社会现实，能够反映当下社会问题，当下人和社会面临的问题。
And so to me, this sort of historical examination is a way of reflecting on our present society. It's a way of looking at who we are now and where we are now.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to return in the remaining time also to talk to you a little bit about the fate of the novel. But before I do, I just want to ask Leonardo about this kind of curious position that Maria Conde is in as someone who's always describing himself as about to begin writing or hoping to begin writing or a failed story writer. And he also exists in this kind of historical twilight zone where clearly he's obsessed with Hemingway and Ava Gardner and thinks of himself as kind of somewhat suspended somewhere out of a Raymond Chandler novel or a Dashiell Hammett novel. And I'm kind of curious about, he's also given to a set of ruminations about history and time, while he's also negotiating and arguing with himself about the difference between being an old man or an old fart. I'd like for you to talk a little bit about how you play with that character as a stand-in for yourself, and how he has this kind of independent life and opens up this view of history for the reader and within the novel.
So, a él le gustaría saber, estamos hablando de Mario Conde, que está en esta posición curiosa, que es un escritor o una persona siempre a punto de ser un escritor, sin empezar en realidad a escribir, pero tiene estas obsesiones con Hemingway y estas preocupaciones literarias y esta visión de sí mismo, y de cierta forma él habita una dimensión desconocida también. Entonces quisiera saber un poco cómo tú utilizas este personaje para reflejar algunas de tus preocupaciones y lo que has expuesto en tus novelas. Did we just lose him?
I'm not sure. I hope it wasn't the question.
No, I
I'm
could just be
joking.
the internet
No, I think it's the
connections in Cuba are so tricky sometimes.
Okay, well, if we regain his presence, which I hope we will,
Okay.
we can return to that. I did want to ask you, and I also really wanted to was hoping I would be able to ask Leonardo this question as well, just about how these different books have been received. And Sjón, I think you talked a little bit about knowledge of this period of history in Iceland. I mentioned that it's something that's not terribly familiar to I think to a larger community of readers. But what has the reception been of your novel? How has it been received in Iceland? What kind of conversation has it started? Is this material so much on the surface, or how is it read?
Well, strangely, in the months leading up to the publication of the book, the presence of neo-Nazis was all of a sudden felt very strongly in Iceland. We hadn't had any demonstrations in the street or in public with swastika flags since 1962. And by a crazy coincidence, these things just started like popping up in the months leading up to the publishing of the book. Wow. So it was very much in people's minds that this was something that was coming back from history, manifesting in the streets of Reykjavik with flyers and everything, and then a demonstration of a group that came to Iceland from all over Scandinavia to support their friends in Iceland. And so the book was received as a timely reminder of where this comes from, and that to try to start to begin to have a conversation about it or understand it. Yeah. Maybe the approach that I propose in the book, which is to look at these people as humans, as people who grow up from the same society as we do and from similar circumstances, that it would, I must say, I think it was welcomed.
So there was not was there not, I was curious if there was anything that came out of the 2008 collapse in Iceland. There was nothing analogous to this moment that you're just describing that came out 13 years ago. So,
I mean, I don't know. Maybe people are getting used to my approach to Icelandic history because I'm always digging into the gray soil of the Twilight Zone, and of course, the history of National Socialism in Iceland from the Second World War to our times, with stops in the riots in the center of town, which is described in the book, and it's like a baptizing moment for the young kid. And you mentioned in your mail to me.
Yeah, it's in Hawthorne Lockness's Adam
novel.
Station. Yeah.
So I think, you know, I mean, let's say that after the financial crash in 2008, we started admitting that we are not just like these innocent, creative children of the North. You know, there are darker sides to our history, and my books have been taking a look at them.
Yeah. Oh, it looks like Leonardo may be rejoining us. Kaye, I in the time remaining, and then I do want to turn back to.
Sorry.
Hello again.
Sorry.
That's okay. Kaye, I just want to ask, like, how widely read is your book in China? It was not published. You weren't able to publish it in China when it was written. It was only recently published in English translation. Does it circulate? And what kind of response does it create among those who are able to read it?
死亡赋格是我的第6部长篇了，写了2年，当时我给了有10个左右的出版社，都被婉拒了。Does Erica is here?
Yeah, I'm here. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Okay, I didn't know you were done. So, Death Fugue is my 6th book. It took me about 2 years to write. When I finished it, I gave it to around 10 different publishing houses to look at, to see if they'd like to publish it, and all of them politely declined.
有的婉拒信写的特别长，有1-2千字，然后充满了赞美，比如说历史视野啊，比如说书写勇气，比如说创新手法等等。但是我们不能出版。
Some of these letters of declination were quite long and very polite, full of praise for the novel, its courage, its historical scope, its epic scope, but we're very sorry to say that we cannot publish this book.
这本书的写作和出版都跟我的别的书有特别大的差异。至于修改，我至少修改了有100-200次这样的。由于时间关系，我就不详细说了。就是基本的脉络就是这样的，就是辗转了2年多以后呢，终于在朋友的推荐下，在台湾的映客出版社和香港的天地图书出版社同时出版繁体版。
So the reception of the book was very different from all the other novels that I've written. And I won't go into the details of how it went, but I spent about 2 years trying to make some small edits to it, make some small changes, making it a little more acceptable, sending it to more publishing houses. And after 2 years, at the behest of some friends, at their recommendation, I ended up deciding to send it to publishing houses in Taiwan and Hong Kong, where it was published in a traditional Chinese edition.
对，英文版其实是在2014年有那个澳大利亚的一个独立出版社叫 Giramondo Publishing， 我特别感谢这个编辑和出版人，就是Ivor Indy， 是他首先将这本书带到了这个英语读者的面前，他倾注了很多心血。
In fact, the book first came out in Australia in 2014 at a publishing house called Giramondo, whose publisher Ivor Indy was very interested in the book and its historical subject, and put a huge amount of time and effort, his own blood, sweat, and tears into bringing this to English language readers.
也就是在出版以后，我参加了悉尼的这个作家节，也就在那个时候，我和 Sjón 我们在同一个文学小组，很高兴我们今天又再一次在布鲁克林图书节见面。
In fact, the last time that I met Sjón was at the Sydney Book Fair after the publication of Death Fugue in Australia. I'm very pleased to have the chance to see him again.
I unfortunately have to pop in because we're I think even 1 minute over time, and I feel terrible about this because I have about 20 questions that I'd like to ask all of you, and several follow-up questions with Leonardo, and I'm sorry that the internet connection was such as it was. I do want to point out that Death Fugue is now published by Restless Books, and this is just such a wonderful thing to have in translation now. Sorry that we didn't get to nearly everything I wanted to talk about, but it's been wonderful to see you all, and I want to thank all of our authors. I want to thank Sjón, Kaye, Sheng, and Leonardo Padura very much for your time, and again, apologies for the glitch. In closing, I'll say, everyone, please remember that you can order the books in the link below, and please consider making a donation to the Brooklyn Book Festival, which this year is celebrating its 16th year of presenting free literary program. I want to thank you all. Your books are wonderful, and it was really a pleasure to be able to talk to you this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank
you.
Thank you.